over. Let's give her as much attention as we can. So, Angela, take it away, please.
I'll get myself unmuted. It's great to see all of you. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you. I wish I could be there in person. I hope at some point I can, and maybe it'll coordinate with one of your meetings and I can swing by and say hello to all of you in person. So thank you for the opportunity to talk with all of you. As a little bit of a background, again, my name is Angela Leek. I have my current role as the Director of Radiological Solutions and Regulatory Affairs at Summit Exercises and Training. But for about 16 years before that, I was with the Iowa Department of Health, and I did lead their radiation control program, which included, a whole myriad of different programs, from emergency response to radioactive materials agreement state program to the X-ray and radon programs, and the whole gamut. So I really enjoy working in the health physics field. Emergency response is one of the areas that I've done some support work nationally through the Radiological Operations Support Specialist Program, working with the FEMA Office of Emerging Threats. It used to be the CBRN office. And so today, what I hope to talk to you guys about is the emergency response aspects of health physics and the types of things that we need to help translate to those first responders. So some of the things I'm going to go through today, I'm sure many of you are very versed in. I've tried to find a middle ground here to make sure we're all on the same page before I dive into some of the topics, especially if some of you haven't worked in emergency response or kind of gone through that part of the details of some of the guidance documents and things like that. I'm trying to hit it at a level that will hopefully let you know where you will be the most beneficial, and then how you can actually help by joining the ROS program, or at least working to assist us through the program. So we'll go ahead and get started. Feel free to let me know if you have any questions. If you do want to stop me, feel free. I'm very laid back. It's a little harder in this arena, but feel free, somebody speak up and say, "Hey, Angela, we have a quick question," and I'll pause, and we can have a discussion. Otherwise, you can wait until the end, and we can have those chats as well. So either way is good with me. Just let me know what works best. So I do want to, before I start, give credit where credit is due. Much of the content, especially the visuals that are the plume models and some of the animations, were developed by Brooke Buttemeyer and the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory team as they were developing the initial ROS curriculum. So I definitely want to give them the credit for that part of this presentation. So as we start here, really, as many of you know, radiation incidents, especially in those first hours and minutes, are going to require the translation of really technical and very unfamiliar information to many of those hazmat technicians, first responders who are there on the scene, into actionable recommendations. And they need that quickly and as accurately as possible, with very little information, be able to figure out how they can best save lives and reduce risks to both the responders and to the public that might be in the impacted area. The good news is, we as health physics, we know the technical aspects of radiation. We know what kinds of materials do what. We know a lot of the guidance documents and the types of principles of properties of the materials, how long they're going to be around, how they're going to disperse, things like that. And we can really assist in applying those in an emergency. So before I dive into too many specifics about how a health physicist can help, I just want to lay some groundwork about what types of incidents we're talking about here. And there are many types of things that can occur with radioactive materials or radiation as a whole. But today we're going to focus on radiological dispersal device, nuclear power plant accidents, nuclear detonation, and then transportation or orphan source. And I'm going to just touch on these very, very briefly. There are trainings and other things that dive more in depth to the actual principles of each of these. So if this is something new to you or something that you're interested in learning more about, let me know. I can direct you to other trainings that will go through each of these in much more depth. But to start, we'll start with a transportation or lost or orphan source. This is probably very familiar to all of you who might be working with materials as a licensee or in your, your capacity of work that you do. The big thing about response to these types of incidences from the first responders' perspective is that we assume that these are an accident, that everybody was trying to do the right thing. There was no nefarious effort to try to circumvent any of the safety features or take something out of its typical transport carrier. And as you all know, the type A and type B containers have certain parameters about how they're supposed to be able to withstand certain accident conditions. And so we can make a lot of assumptions that the required shielding and those other protections are intact. And so the protections that are there for the responders as they roll up to the scene can be somewhat assumed. And that means that some of our perimeters that might be put around an area of a transportation incident might be able to be smaller than they would be if we thought a terrorist was involved and was trying to maximize the amount of exposure they could get for people from taking that source out of its lead container or device for transport. So typically then, from that perspective, these are going to be relatively small scale compared to some of the others, and you'll see as we go through this how that compares. And there's a low likelihood of someone reaching acute radiation dose. Now it's possible, but it would be someone who gets really, really close. In a transportation incident, very unlikely. Orphan source, maybe if it's outside of its shield, but it would have to be somebody up there close for a period of time. It's not going to be something that a majority of the population is going to immediately be being impacted by ARS. And hopefully we would know about the transportation incident. No one would be sneaking this orphan source, into a movie theater or something like that. So that's kind of the perspective here for these types of incidents. And then many of you are familiar with the type A and type B packages. The types of incidents we're talking about here would be, just a radiographer is, staying at a hotel, or his truck got stolen, or hopefully the device doesn't fall out the back of his truck, but things happen. And those, or maybe they're in a vehicle accident. And this type B package is meant to withstand that. And so the amount of exposure that someone would get shouldn't be any different than it would be if this is just sitting at a work site. So keeping all of that in mind, we also know a lot about what kind of material we're dealing with, because things are labeled and they have transport indexes, and the different placards or labels that are put on to the shipment give some indication about the level of risk and give us a quick reference to be able to understand whether or not something is dislodged or broken or open within the package. So if the readings aren't measuring what we were expecting, we can get a lot of information from just those shipping papers and the placard information. And so the responders are trained in that, and that puts them forward in the response because they have that information at their ready. And then an orphan source, as you would be aware, if it's left in its shielded container and it really did just fall off of something, or just got left behind in a closet after a licensee left or something like that, those types of things would be fairly innocuous. But if somehow it did fall out of its shielded container, it could generate a pretty significant distance of exposure to people. For example, this is a cobalt-60, about 5,500 curies. And the estimations is that it could go out about 500 meters, where we would have an exposure rate of 10 MR per hour. So in that case, you can see that it goes down the streets where we have the buildings shielding that shine. So that there are people that could receive exposures in this case. So in this type of an incident, we're going to become very handy as a health physicist to be able to help reconstruct doses, understand what kind of exposure people may have received if they were in these areas before they realized the exposure was occurring. And those are things that we can bring to the table to help those responders and the public understand what kind of a risk they assumed. So in contrast to a transportation or an orphan source, where it's probably is or has recently been in possession of someone who is not meaning to do anything bad, A radiological dispersal device does assume that this is a bad guy who got their hands on materials and wants to disperse it. Often when we talk about this, we talk about a dirty bomb, where somebody took an improvised explosive device, so a pipe bomb, something like that, and happened to get radioactive material into it, whether it's a source or some sort of configuration where when the explosion occurs, it can disperse the radioactive material that was placed into it. But it is, for all principal purposes, an improvised explosive device or other sort of conventional explosive. They can also be a dispersal device that could be spread by a drone or other sorts of dispersion factors, through an air ventilation system, those kinds of things are things that are dispersible. But today we're going to mostly just talk about the dirty bomb or the explosive version of the dispersal device. But keep in mind, it could be all of those things. The middle box is probably not for you guys, but we often try to remind people, and this is important for health physicists to do as well. Many times when people think about an RDD, they're thinking about the mushroom cloud from a nuclear detonation. We try to remind them that this is not the same thing, that this is just like, unfortunately, we've seen like at the Boston bombing and other types of explosions, even the Oklahoma City bombing, it's the same sort of destruction. It just would have the mess of contamination coming along with it. And so from a radiological perspective, it's almost more of a disruption device than anything else, because the contamination itself is likely not going to be that significant for any of the responders or even for the public. But we'll talk about a couple of different parameters of this that could feed into additional exposure. But if it's, a cesium or something that's going to readily aerosolize and disperse, the amount of contamination really is more of a long-term hazard than an acute type of an exposure. But we know that that's going to hamper emergency response efforts. People are going to hear radiation, they're going to be very hesitant to go into the area. Sometimes that might prohibit some of the life-saving activities that need to occur, or may have them set up perimeters that are unmanageable, way bigger than they need to be because of the amount of exposure that they want to, or that they're able to measure and they want to try to avoid. So this is an example of an RDD. This was work by Fred Harper, who many of you may be familiar with, who's done a lot of work on figuring out how radioactive material disperses in various types of explosions. So this is some of his work. But you can see how, and this is very slow motion, but you can see how this is just a conventional explosive device. It's not necessarily a huge footprint. And as this transitions over, you can see it, depending on the type of material that was put in here, if it's aerosolized, those small particles or other types of material that's able to be sent aloft will be entrained in a fireball. And then that sort of material is what can go downwind. However, if it's more of a metallic or a solid structure that isn't going to be affected, aerosolized by the blast, we are going to end up with more along the lines of ballistic particles. We'll have ballistic particles regardless, but if that material is going to become a ballistic particle, we can have small sources kind of being scattered across the explosion site, and those could become shrapnel that embed in people, and that can cause some significant exposure. But we have a video I'm going to show you about how we train the responders to understand the exposure rate so that they can understand that the dose that they would receive is manageable, even if in those worst case scenarios where they have a piece of source lodged in them as a patient. So this is just a picture again of some of that work that Fred Harper did on how these different particles become the ballistic fragments through the explosion. So you can see, for example, a cobalt slab turns into kind of big shards of shrapnel. Even in iridium, the little discs, they remain fairly intact and could also become kind of flying debris. So when we look at what the extent of an RDD might be, it's usually going to be an area of a few city blocks. And that is where we would see, close in, right around the detonation site, is where we might see maybe 10 R per hour as an exposure rate. and we call that a dangerous radiation zone based off of the NCRP guidance. NCRP calls a 10 MR per hour zone as a hot zone. And so you can see that we would see 10 MR per hour just a couple of blocks away from the detonation site. And then this is also assuming some aerosolization, so things are going downwind. If it was just an explosion with ballistic particles, we'd see just more of a circle around the hot zone area, and we wouldn't have things traveling as far downwind. The next slide, though, is going to kind of show us if we would add in the 2 MR per hour, which many people are used to using because it's the NRC licensee's public exclusion zone, where we don't want anyone to get more than 2 MR in any given hour. And so this is where you can see that by using that zone, it might be manageable, but it does increase the amount of area that the responders would need to cover and to need to consider versus using 10 MR per hour as a hot zone boundary. And so, depending on the incident, we need to help advise on, what is the best boundary to use. And if 2 MR per hour is, safe enough for them and it doesn't extend their resources, then it's not a huge difference if they want to use that. But if that really is going to add to their resources, they don't have enough to kind of exclude that area and to manage the population under that area. Because think of a really densely populated area where you could have, several thousand people in one of these or 2 of these city blocks. It might be more manageable to stay at 10 MR per hour and manage the aspects of the scene beyond the radiological considerations. So these types of discussions that we have with the responders, what we try to help them understand is the exposure rate versus the dose that they would be potentially receiving as an accumulated dose. And sometimes that's a hard concept for them to understand. And so this video was created through the DHS response to a radiological dispersal device called the first 100 minutes. And so these videos go with each of the missions and tactics that are outlined in that guidance document. And I would recommend that you go find that document if you haven't been familiar with it before. It does help to kind of put in perspective what the responders' priorities are on scene and how the radiological aspect fits into it. So I'm going to play this video just for you, and I hope the sound is coming through. So if it's not, somebody raise their hand and I'll figure out what I need to change about the settings, but we're going to try it here.
No sound. No sound.
All right. That's what I was afraid of. So I'm going to stop presenting for a second and I'm going to re-present. I think there's a setting I have to click. Let me double check this. Sorry about that. I was going to check this beforehand and I forgot. There we go. Apparently, I have to share a tab instead of a screen in order to share that. So, and I don't have options for a tab. Let's see. Maybe I can do a window. Nope. Okay. Let me try. I don't know that it's going to work. But let me try again. I'm going to hit play again, but you guys let me know how it works. Are you hearing it?
No, it's me. It looks like it's muted still.
Okay, let me see.
Option when you start playing it, it showed a mute speaker, but you might, I don't know if you can do it on the screen to unmute it there.
Yeah, I'm not sure because because I don't see that on my end. Let me see.
It's at the right-hand end of that progress bar, opposite end from the play button.
Okay, so I have it. I can hear it on my end, so.
Way too loud.
So I'm gonna talk over this. So I am going to mute it, but I don't hear it. So I'll just talk over it. I can tell you what it's saying, and how we communicate this message to the first responders. So, but I would recommend that you go out and see this. There's several videos like this. They're very interesting. And it's kind of a computer automated voice that over speaks on this. So we'll go ahead and give it a start, and then we'll see how it goes. So fundamentally what this does is it's a training tool for first responders to be able to play this on their own, and it explains and talks over the top about each of the missions and tactics. So this is mission number 3, initiate life-saving activities. And so what we're trying to get across here for responders is it is okay to go in, because many times for this, and these are the missions and tactics that they explain about, how they fit into the overall overall scheme of the response strategies that they're going to do. So when a first responder is running into the scene, they're going to be entering into 2 MR per hour, 10 MR per hour, 10 R per hour, and they probably never had their meter going off the way that it's gone off, because these things don't happen all the time. So this video is trying to get across to them that it's okay to go ahead and go in and do life-saving activities. This video is created off of animations of a real amount of time that it would take someone as a firefighter to get someone out of the scene. So while it looks like they're walking fast or it looks like they're running, it isn't, it's not the time you're seeing on the screen. It's the time that they calculated for people to get a person out. So if it took, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever they estimated. So what you show are the 2 bubbles. And so the top one is the rate that they're experiencing. And so as they get close to a source fragment, we let them know it could be greater than 10 R per hour. It could even be up to like 30 R per hour, as you see on the one responder. But the actual dose that they're accumulating during the time that they're near that patient or transporting the patient is slowly accumulating. So, as you all know, very familiar, you have to be there for an hour to get that exposure. And so that is the type of information we want to let them know. The other piece that we want to let them know is that typically for a radiological dispersal device, that aerosolization, that up in the air, the explosion parameters that push things up into the air go up and are back down as a deposition on the ground within about 15 minutes. So that if they don't have their full PPE and respirators and all that stuff, they don't need to wait for that before they go in, because there's probably not a lot, if it's been 15 minutes, a lot in the air. Now there's also resuspension. I think the assumption is it's about 1/1000 of the deposition that could resuspend, especially in bigger, more like driving or very aggressive activities. So we try to let them know, like, if you have an N95 mask with you, you have a PAPR with you, something that you can just throw on. You don't need to wait for your full SCBA if you don't happen to have it. So those are those types of things we're trying to get across to them, so that they don't have their meter screaming at them and they think that it's going to be lethal or dangerous to them to go in to save the people, because they actually have a lot of bandwidth to be able to save a lot of people, especially if they just go in and pull them back out to somewhere that they can triage them. So that's a really important message that health physicists can help to translate for the first responders. So we're going to jump to nuclear power plant. I probably don't have to explain nuclear power plants to all of you, but what we try to get across for the nuclear power plant for our first responders and others is that there's a lot of planning that goes on around a nuclear power plant. So most responders around these facilities are familiar with what could happen and what their role is. So they're more educated about how to respond in that specific type of an incident. We try to remind them that there's often an early warning, because the plants know what's going on at their facilities, and so they know if something's starting to go wrong. And many of their schemes for declaring emergencies have early aspects to that, from an unusual event to an alert to a site area emergency. Those things are going to happen well before we reach a general emergency. And even in those serious cases like Fukushima, we saw that there was even time before a general emergency was technically reached, before a release started to occur, even during that earthquake and tsunami. It is also that the release is going to occur over time. Often it's in puffs, where they try to control how much is getting out of the facility if possible. And often evacuation or sheltering And in some jurisdictions default to evacuation. And the reason for that, it can be effective because you can time it around those puff releases, or try to, get populations taking an action before a release actually would be occurring or reach the facility, the locations where those individuals are located. So again, this slide is how we communicate to the first responders on kind of how the nuclear power plant works. We try to reinforce that the containment structure is going to keep the material all inside there. There's many layers of protection. But if for some reason some of those materials are able to get out of that system, there's usually a good ability to know what's coming out, or some good estimation of the types of products we might see. And again, just like transportation, we've got a lot of information to go off of because we know what that plant's been doing over the past years or months of operation. And then, it's a kind of a revisit for, that puff type release. This is a chart of kind of the release from Fukushima. And you can see that, it took a little bit after the earthquake and tsunami for the emergency to get declared. Then even after that emergency was declared, it took a bit for Unit 1 to have its issues. They got a few things under control, and then Unit 2 or Unit 3 actually came about. And as each unit started to have more contribution or more issues were happening at each of those locations, you can see that the overall release rates started to increase the amount of exposures that we were seeing, but still varied. And so we can kind of see that coming. Usually there's something happening at the plant that will forewarn us that a spike in those release rates would be starting to be seen. And so again, we can kind of figure out what the right protective action is around those things. And again, we try to explain to them as well that, we might have a release happening. Sometimes it will be in the air and as a plume overhead while the release is occurring. Some of that settling down on the ground. Once the release is stopped, we will have it on the ground for a long time, and it's going to start to get through other routes of ingestion, inhalation, just external dose, as well as, into future crops, future animals, milk products, things like that. So that's becomes really important for any radiological incident, is to help people understand, why we need to do sampling and measurements of these things to make sure that we understand what kind of impact that could have on dose longer term. And then nuclear detonation, we also talked. Obviously, this is the thing that most people are thinking of when they think of a radiation incident with that mushroom cloud. Often they're thinking of the movies where we have a huge one. The planning scenarios that typically we plan around that were established by kind of the national planning scenarios a few years ago. One of them was a pandemic, and we've had one of those, obviously. So a 10 kiloton nuclear detonation device as an improvised nuclear device is one of those planning scenarios as well. And this takes into assumption that this device would be improvised, which means the bad guy figures out how to get his hands on it and get it detonated, not that it is a strategic attack from one of our, other countries in the world. So that is what this planning scenario kind of bases all of these assumptions on. And this one, there will probably be no or little notice that it's going to occur. All the materials released all at once through the fission process of the detonation. When we use the EPA PAC manual, 1 rem total effective dose as our measure for starting to consider public protections, that area can exceed 100 miles when we do that calculation. And we'll talk a little bit about how that could impact response and resource allocation and just kind of the overall ability to manage the scene if we try to apply that number in a nuclear detonation. The main hazard from this type of an improvised nuclear device is going to be obviously the prompt radiation, which will be mostly where the radiation or the severe damage zone, people have a lot of other issues going on in addition to the prompt radiation. But the direct shine from fallout is going to be significant, especially early in the incident. So the highest hazard is early. half of the energy is released in the first hour. And then the amount of, the fallout plume deposition decays rapidly over the first 24 hours. So it will grow and then shrink, and the exposure rates reduce with a 7 to 10 factor. So for every 7-fold factor of time, those will decrease by a factor of 10. So we can use that to our benefit by having people go inside to use the building protection until those rates decrease. So when we do response for nuclear detonation, we use damage zones as well as radiation zones to define the areas of impact. So we talk about the severe damage zone. For responders, that is a low priority area. There's very few people that will survive that area just from the physical and thermal impacts of the explosion, but also anybody that did happen to survive probably received a lethal dose of radiation from the prompt radiation that occurs in that area. That's going to be about half a mile for a 10 kiloton. The moderate damage zone goes out further than that, maybe out to a mile. And that's where people may be trapped in buildings because the building facades are very damaged. People might not be able to get out of those buildings without significant help, like from urban search and rescue or something like that. But they have not received potentially, whatever dose they've received is likely treatable or survivable. And some of them may not have received much radiation at all, but they need someone to get in and get them because they could have some trauma and some other types of injuries that they need taken care of. The light damage zone, so that's why the moderate damage zone is the initial priority. Those people need that help to survive. The light damage zone is more like tornado damage or high wind damage, where you might have windows blown out from the overpressure. You could have, most buildings intact. You can have glass injuries, maybe some car accidents from flash blindness, things like that. But those injuries are expected to be less severe. And for those that aren't under the purple areas, which are the hot zone and the dangerous fallout zone or dangerous radiation zone, they are not going to have had any radiation exposure. And so somehow we've got to get the firefighters to walk through all those people and get into the orange area to help those people that need to actually be extracted. However, we also have to get them to prioritize their activities to that backside of the impact area where there is not fallout occurring. And that includes those response agencies that are under the fallout. So if they're under the dangerous radiation zone, we could have upwards of 100 R per hour occurring in those hours of the incident. And so if they go out for a couple of hours, we've now had a very significant amount of exposure they've received. And anybody that, takes a while to walk through this area is going to receive that dose as well. So we try to tell the responders to stay inside until they have radiation detection that can guide them on their exposure rates, or they've heard from someone else that they're not in a fallout area any longer, or that the exposure rates have decreased to a level that is manageable. And when I say manageable, I mean getting down into maybe the 10 R per hour or 10, hopefully we can get down to 10 MR per hour, but they may need to start going to do some activities in a 10 R per hour rate, which is more manageable than 100 R per hour rate. And so, if we wait that 7-fold factor of time, that's how much of a change could occur in one area. So we need to get them to stay and wait, which is really hard to get a responder to do. So fallout, just as a primer, again, we try to give that information for them. It's formed when the detonation is close to the ground. So if we have a detonation that occurs up above the ground, then we will not have fallout. It will still have those blast impacts and thermal impacts and those rings of damage that we talked about, but we will not have the fallout consideration for those downwind impacts. The other thing is that mushroom cloud is going to go up 30,000 plus feet in the air, up where a jetliner travels. And the various levels of the atmosphere can have different wind and different weather occurring. And so we may have the fallout going in various directions, not necessarily in the trajectory of the ground level observed weather. So we need to understand what's happening in those upper level atmospheric conditions so that we can guide where downwind might actually be. It's going to consist of visible dust and debris. Many of you have seen those in, I'm sure, some of the things that you've worked with in some of the early tests that were conducted. And we used to do atmospheric tests, and brushing off the materials like large sandy particles is very effective. That's actually how the military did it back in the day with booms. And it is something that is able to be done. So we advise the public to, and the responders to, if you're in the fallout, try to, change your clothes if possible, because that gamma coming from those particles is really what is giving the significant exposure. We're not as worried about inhalation or ingestion because of the large diameter of the particles, but when we compare that to the amount of gamma radiation that they might receive, the gamma and the external exposure quickly become the primary concern. And then we have to keep in mind too, a lot of people for the nuclear power plant response think, oh, we need to evacuate people, we need to get people out. When we have that large exposure potential, especially in the fallout area, we need to balance that with the building structures. Is the structure on fire? Is it habitable? Is it providing the protection factor that we're assuming it is? If not, we need to figure out what to do quickly. If it is, then they are best to stay there. Because imagine that if you're trying to traverse this street, you're not gonna be quickly getting out of here. And so if it takes you an hour to walk out of here and you are in a 50 R or 100 R per hour area, you have now exposed yourself to a lot of radiation. And we can use building protection factors, and this is in the EPA PAG manual, as well as the nuclear detonation guidance document that came out. I think it was updated in 2020, May of 2022, I believe, from FEMA. And you can see that we get some significant protection factors from buildings. Going, to the center of a high-rise apartment office building, you get 100 times protection factor, which is great, especially if you're just going to wait for that 100 R per hour or higher dose rate or exposure rate to reduce down into something that they can actually traverse in a couple of hours without receiving, hundreds of R. Even small buildings, though, that are more of a 2-story or 3-story, get down into a basement structure. We can get down into that 100 times reduction factor, or even 200. But even just a 2-story, 20 times reduction factor can be significant. And the chart on the right-hand side, you can see this is Omaha as an example. It's clearly just an example. But if everybody's outside with a protection factor of 1, for that kind of generic population, we could have 32,000 people as a casualty. However, if we can get people to get into even just an adequate protection of 10 times reduction, we can prevent 19,000 of those people from getting an exposure that will cause a casualty. And then if we can get them into a good one, then you can see we can take most of that exposure risk away. And again, most of that exposure occurs in those first hours of the detonation. And so getting the message out to go inside and stay inside, even into just a strong structure, is very helpful. And that's something that we hope that everybody who learns about this and knows about this will help to share with their community and the public, so that the public does know what to do in an incident like this, because this is the primary way we can protect people. And unfortunately, if they don't know ahead of time, it's going to be hard to communicate this into that area if their communications are damaged. And so we need people to know that ahead of time. So I've kind of drizzled a few things throughout the conversation about how we talk to first responders about these items, how we try to translate. But there are a few specific things I want to point out about how health physicists specifically can help with those technical aspects of an emergency. And one of those that's really important is comparing those timing and the extent of the radiological impacts. I talked about that a little bit when I introduced each of the types of incidents, but there are a few ways that we can really kind of drive this home, especially if the first responders or the communities that we're dealing with are used to planning for a certain type of an incident, like say a nuclear power plant. The way they are going to approach that may not be the best approach for a nuclear detonation, let's say. So by going through some of these comparisons, we can help to make sure we don't overreact or underreact from the radiological aspect, because we always need to keep in mind that there are other things that the first responders and the communities need to consider. So throughout these next slides, I'm going to be using the EPA PAG manual's early phase dose kind of projections that are used commonly in nuclear power plants and in the EPA PAG manual for advising on whether it's appropriate to shelter or evacuate the public. So those of you that are familiar with that, that's the lower limit of that. We calculate a total effective dose. And I'm just going to talk total effective dose today. There's other parameters, but if we calculate a total effective dose, which means that they were exposed to the plume and the ground shine for 4 days with no protection factor assumed, if we do a calculation and exceed 1 rem, then we start to talk about public protection. And if we exceed 5 rem, that's kind of the upper side of that. This is an example of what that would look like if we used that for a nuclear power plant. So, you know, that's why we have the 10-mile EPZ. People have done lots of these calculations and realize that the possibility is that it could go to the 10-mile EPZ or long, or, you know, maybe a little further. And so this looks very familiar. If you look up close where that arrow is pointing, and I'm going to use my cursor here, this tiny little piece right here, that is the scope of the same light. So the same light yellow of 1 rem over 4 days of exposure is that same little piece right here for an RDD. So you can see the difference in the size and the scope of an RDD versus a nuclear power plant incident. If we go to the next phase now, this is if we applied those same calculations for decision making and for protective actions to a nuclear detonation, this is how far it would go. And this is where I'm saying it could go hundreds of miles. So this, for perspective, is the nuclear power plant scope for that. And again, this uses the Fukushima release source term. And this is that 10 kiloton. So you can see it's a very much larger. So if we stick to these numbers, we are going to be impacting many more of the population than we might have the capacity to actually handle, because we have to remember that in this close-in area, we've got a lot of damage and a lot of really high exposures occurring. So if we're spending a bunch of resources on 1 rem over 4 days, we may run out of resources and not be really helping the people who are in here getting 50 rem in a matter of 4 days. So health business, yeah.
The scales, and that's very good. Where on earth is this? Is this at Fukushima, or is this?
It's Washington.
No, so
Yeah,
yeah, I think that this overlay is an example of I think it's New York, I believe. So like Manhattan area is the scenario that was used for these demonstrations. Again, this is a drill. I'm going to say that for the recording here.
see that.
So, yep.
Thank you, Angela.
Yeah. So yeah. So for scope and size, you can see that.
I've driven every interstate.
DC. I think this is DC because I see Maryland there.
Yeah.
So yeah. Sorry about that. So yes.
Right.
So, but they did use the Fukushima source term and just put it at the same detonation location as the nuke det was run. So, so that you can see the difference in size and scale.
Certainly. Thank you.
Good plugs when I call.
So the other piece then is that timing. So again, those that are familiar with nuclear power plant types of response, some of the default is let's move people, get them out before the release gets to them or before they have the ability to, you know, have the plume already out and overhead, which is great for a nuclear power plant because of the timing of the release. For a nuclear detonation, we don't have that time. And this demonstration, this visual kind of gives you that ability to show it to responders. And so again, this is the Fukushima incident source term, and then again, a 10 kiloton nuclear detonation. And I'll run this a couple of times because it'll go through and then we'll need to do it again. The dark purple is where we would see 10 R per hour. The light purple is where we'd see 10 MR per hour. And you can see that we have all of that 10 R per hour shrinking away over the first day, 2 days, but we're left with a 10 MR per hour for 7 days, 14 days, 1 month. 4 months, 5 months. As we get out to a year, you can see that the area where we would see 10 MR per hour starts to be very similar in size as it would be for a nuclear power plant, but it takes us a year to get there. And then, of course, we're going to have much more area covered in those long-term fission products, those long-lived fission products, much more area covered in those for a nuclear detonation than we would for a nuclear power plant for the size and scope. But the timing is really important because, you know, if we follow that, let's get people evacuating in the first couple of hours, we're sending them out in the dangerous radiation zone, where within about 10 hours, if we got them to shelter for a few hours, we are now dealing with a 10 MR per hour in most of those areas where previously we would have been exceeding 10 R per hour. So this is a nice visual to kind of show people why we need to wait in a nuclear detonation versus trying to, you know, take action right away. And so some of the things that go along with this is using these concepts to help the communities, the first responders, develop protective action recommendations. And that could be for worker protection. So again, it could be those PPE requirements. We don't need, you know, especially for a nuclear detonation, N95 mask, things that are much more readily available now after COVID will be just fine. But obviously we need to also be paying attention to what other hazards they might be getting into, because there might be other debris that they need to not inhale, kind of like the post 9/11 type of consideration. There could be other types of consideration. We can also guide on dosimetry, dose reduction planning, so like worker stay times. We might need to be helping them decide what to do with the public and the timing of those recommendations. And then ongoing for years to come, we will be talking about remediation, waste management, what to do with those areas, how to get people back to those areas if possible. All the things that we hear about with Fukushima that they're dealing with, as well as some of the other more industrial type cleanups that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. One of the concepts that we also need to remind a lot of individuals about is we are looking to make recommendations based off avoidable dose. So if someone is, you know, in the nuclear power plant plume and they fix the power plant and no more plume is going to go by, then we need to do the calculation on what they would get from deposition for the rest of the time they would be there over 4 days or however long we're trying to calculate. Same with the nuclear detonation. If we leave somebody sheltered for 2 days, and then we're trying to decide whether or not it's worth evacuating them or not, we need to do calculations from the point at which we are at into the future, because we can't do anything about the 50 rem they've already received or the 5 rem they've already received. But we can do something about the additional 50 rem or the additional 5 rem or the additional 2 rem that they're going to receive. And that is where we want to be comparing some of those protective action guide numbers to that. So there might be some cases where we didn't get them out in time. They received some dose, you know, minimally because they went inside and they got the sheltering factor. But now that exposure is, you know, reduced, they might be in an area where we do the calculation. We're like, well, now they're not really exceeding any of the PAGs in that area. And so we wouldn't need to evacuate those people necessarily, because the dose they received from what went overhead was what contributed to everything, and what's left behind isn't. Now, the likelihood of that is probably low. People are going to want to be out. They're not going to stay around. But from a radiological perspective, this is really where we're trying to make sure we're doing those calculations from, so that we're comparing the amount of dose we can avoid with the risk of what the evacuation or other action might entail. And again, reminding people that, you know, the default public protections in the EPA PAG manual are based off of dose over 4 days. And so if we, you know, a lot of people want to rush in that first 2 hours to get people moving, we actually, yes, we want to keep people's dose as low as possible. But if that's going to cause a bunch of traffic jams, or we don't have traffic and access control put in place in time for that, it's okay to wait for 8 hours or 16 hours, because it's not all going to come in at once. We're trying to keep them from getting that cumulative dose over the time. So we need to help them balance the radiation risk with a lot of factors, but that includes how risky is the actual strategy we're putting in place? What is moving a population and not allowing them to come back going to do for the economy? Do we need some people to stay behind to keep critical infrastructure for the larger region functioning? What are the political views of the people that have a say in this? What is the risk perception of the population? We might tell them, no, it's fine, you're not exceeding PAGs, and they have no business, they have no interest in hearing that. They may want a public protection that is something that's not based in the radiation risk. It's based in their comfort level of that risk. And our communication of that is really vital. So that is where we kind of come in by translating some of the guidance. So there's a lot of guidance out there, particularly with NCRP, the response guidance for responding to an improvised nuclear device, that 100-minute guidance I mentioned, the EPA PAG manual. These guidance documents all have assumptions that go into them, various ways that we can apply these to various incidents. And most of the first responders or the decision makers that we're talking to as health physicists have not read these documents, and they're not going to pull them out at an incident. And so we can do a lot of good by helping these be integrated into the plans, having realistic numbers be placed in, socializing some of the numbers so it's not the first time people are hearing these high numbers that we might need to operate in. So again, just we've talked about this, and I've kind of assumed that you guys know what the PAG manual is, but for those of you that don't, the EPA Protective Action Guide is often used for nuclear power plants, but it is applicable for all types of radiological incidents. And this is where those numbers come from. There are a lot of recommendations that are based in very conservative estimations, which is good, but we need to remember that these are very conservative. And so if there are other things that are in place, so for example, we shelter people and they're all going into a building that can give them some sort of a protective action, or sorry, a sheltering protection factor, then maybe when we did that projected dose of 5 rem, maybe that gets reduced by 5 or 10 times. And so we are no longer kind of at that PAG number. So we can take into account some of those things as we're helping them weigh those factors that I went through earlier. The other thing too is we need to help them kind of define their zones and make sure everyone is actually talking the same language. This is an example from a document that was created for the Radiological Operations Support Specialist, and it's in the Ross Toolkit on Rad Responder. And it talks about all the different guidance documents and reference documents that talk about a zone that is 10 MR per hour. And you can see that sometimes it's called a hot zone, sometimes it's called an outer perimeter, sometimes it's called a low radiation zone. Sometimes it's called a hot zone at 2 MR per hour. And so we have to be careful when someone says, I set up a hot zone, which number are they using? And so it's really important as a health physicist that we help to kind of ask those questions and get people to make sure we're all using the same numbers or language when we say a word. If not, help people realize what the differences are. Same thing can happen with the dangerous radiation zone or the high radiation zone. When you look at 100 R per hour, some call it a high exposure rate, some call it a turnback limit. 10 R per hour, it can be called a dangerous radiation, dangerous fallout zone. It could be called an inner perimeter. So just making sure that we know what everybody's speaking as far as numbers and language. Also, contamination thresholds. This becomes kind of an issue once in a while because in nuclear power plant world, a lot of those numbers and those contamination thresholds got set from the CDD 700s that had a very low efficiency. And so now with our newer types of equipment that we have higher efficiency. And so the don't need to make such a correction factor for our contamination threshold. So many plans, though, still say 360 counts per minute above background. And so, as we look at the new Ludlums, you can see that would equate to 14,000 counts per minute because of the efficiency factor of that other equipment. And so the smaller number that we're looking for, the longer and more methodical of a survey that we need to do, and the more people we're going to tag as contaminated that need to use our decode resources. And so if you've got a handful of people, no big deal. If you have 1,000 people, it's going to become more difficult. If you have 100,000 people, like they did in Goiânia, Brazil, it's going to be very difficult to get people through. And you may have them standing outside in elements like rain or cold or hot. That could be more detrimental than the 360 counts per minute that you're going for on a high efficiency probe or higher efficiency probe. So this is where we can come in and help them make adjustments. They got people piling up outside. It's taking forever to get people through. We can say, maybe we should raise your threshold limit, and it's okay to do so, and this is why. So there's some documents on all of that as well. The emergency worker dosimetry and PPE as well is important. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. There's a lot of guidance for that, particularly some of the NCRP reports and documents. NCRP report 165 has a lot of great information, and I think it's out for free. And then with the Health Physics Society membership, you also can get many of these NCRPs at a reduced rate if you didn't know that already. So if you go out onto the HPS members site, you can see how you can get them for a reduced rate. I would recommend getting some of these if you wanted to do more in the emergency response area if you haven't already done so. So specifically for doses, often people wait for a radiation meter or wait for a dosimetry before they want to go in. And we need to remember that, or they'll use the worker stay times to manage the exposures to a level that's aligning with maybe occupational exposures. And while that's always a great goal, early in an emergency, we really do need people to go in and get those people that need life-saving care. And they may have to go into an area that isn't necessarily going to correspond with something that they would do occupationally or that we'd be used to doing occupationally. And so we don't want to really set limits for dose. We want to set decision points. So if they reach a certain rate or a certain accumulation of dose, we might want them to pause and call back in and say, should I proceed? If they're almost done with their mission and they're going to exit out anyway, maybe they should finish the mission. If they are halfway in and they reach that, then maybe we do have them turn around and come back out. But if they're going to, get a school of children out, maybe it is worth it. And maybe, if we're reaching 5 rem or even 25 rem, maybe they're willing to take a few more rem to go get those kids. And those are the types of things we don't want people to stop and actually not complete a really critical mission by calling it a limit and having people stop. The other piece, there's some confusion in some of the literature. NCRP is trying to put out some guidance that we can follow and really leverage. But OSHA still has a lot of regulatory language that doesn't really give a lot of opening for emergencies. But there really isn't a lifetime dose limit or a dose of record for an emergency. Yes, we are going to go back through and try and do a dose reconstruction to see what each of the responders got. Their workplace is going to want to track that. But we don't want to have them, be worrying about that or tracking it in the same way we do our occupational workers over years of work, because we need them to do that work. However, and I have a slide that I'll go to next, but the main reason is, we do our dosimetry program occupationally because we're trying to optimize the amount of exposure that they're receiving for the work that they're doing, right? And so it's over a long period of time. And so we are doing a lot of assessments, and we have the ability to see upticks or see changes and change work practices in order to reduce that or alter their work schedule in order to do that. We will use worker stay times and other types of exposure measurements to do that for emergency workers. But if they go in to do a life-saving mission and they come out, doing some sort of a dosimetry tracking, ALARA type assessment, the way we do occupationally, won't have any benefit for that emergency worker because they've, again, already received that dose. So this will come into play a little bit further as we go through the incident and get into more of a routine, less critical infrastructure, less life-saving, and start to do more of the longer term recovery from the incident. The personal protective equipment can help to guide with some of that and help take some of that potential for internal exposure away. But again, that balance needs to happen between waiting and having a detriment to the response by waiting for PPE when it might not be absolutely necessary to the level that they're waiting for, And with from an alpha potential exposure, yes, you should wait for personal protective equipment in this case because of the type of exposure. So we need to be able to give them a definitive way to make a decision and really weigh the risks and benefits of doing the mission with the equipment that they have. So we might do group dosimetry, we might prioritize different actions, personal protective equipment or deployment of personal protective equipment to certain people who are going in a certain area, which means other people might go into an area they normally wouldn't without PPE, but they need to because the other people get the PPE that are going into the maybe moderate damage zone or something like that. But again, after that emergency phase is done, we are going to try to return to dose guidelines that are closer to regulatory limits for occupational workers, but that's not going to be until we've tried to save everyone we can save. We don't have anybody in harm's way. We've kind of put all those fires out, and we're really moving from that initial rescue to more of a recovery. So the final thing that the health physicists and particularly radiological operations support specialists can do is they can bring technical tools. And these can range from guidance like the CDC's risk hazard scale, helping to translate NARAC or FIRMAC data products, helping to interface with REACTs on treatment and triage, as well as RAD Responder. And RAD Responder is listed in the National Response Framework in the Nuke RAD Incident Annex as the main whole community solution for situational awareness. Many state and local agencies use RAD Responder. Our federal agencies are also working to make sure that they're plugged into it. And this is a way that we can get some good situational awareness from both templates to NARAC models, FIRMAC models and plots, and also field readings that are coming in from the field. And so as a radiation protection specialist, we can understand what those measurements might be meaning, how they're translating to some of the plume models that we've run, and helping to figure out whether or not our models are reflecting what the field is telling us and making revisions as we go forward. So this is a really important area where people may be accessing this information and not have the background to be able to translate what some of these readings mean, or to even plug into those that can help translate. So this is one of those areas that we really do work hard to make sure that our ROS are proficient in. And speaking of ROS, I want to go through that just a little bit. This is one of the main ways that health physicists can help. The Radiological Operations Support Specialist Program was started almost 10 years ago, even a little bit before that, but it's really become formalized in the last 10 years. There have been numerous classes that have been done to take health physicists, people that really know radiation, and train them on how to interface with the emergency response community and to help translate some of the radiation principles and the things that the first responders need to know into actionable guidance. And so ROS are trained and they are actually typed through the National Incident Management System as a national qualification system type, just like a firefighter or a section chief or other types of incident command roles are typed. A ROS is a type 1, 2, or a 3, and they're trained throughout the various levels to support all of those types of incidents that we talked about throughout this presentation. So we really do need subject matter experts from the radiation field to be a part of this community. We do have ROS from state and local government, which is really important, and they bring a great asset. But if something happens in any one of these, they are going to have regular day jobs and assignments that they're going to need to do. And so we need to be able to bring people from other parts of the industry or other parts of the country to come to that area to help those jurisdictions, because many state and local entities don't have enough staff, even for a 24-hour staffing, and then expand that over weeks and months. It's just the resources aren't there. And so it is a volunteer role. Sometimes for exercises, we do have some travel compensation that's offered by the state, but most of the training, most of those things are done kind of on volunteer time. And we're working hard to have states, I think there's about 36 states now that have state ROS coordinators. And so wherever you live, so for all of you maybe in Washington State or Oregon or other places up that way, you would have a state ROS coordinator that you would kind of interface with locally. And then all of that is coordinated through the FEMA Office of Emerging Threats office that is kind of coordinating all of those state coordination roles. So the FEMA, like I said, is a 509 position. This is just a snapshot of the position qualification. You can actually Google this online. I can also I'll send a link out to Todd after all of this, and it'll have links to the guidance documents I talked about, as well as these documents I'm showing here. So that outlines kind of the different types of qualifications that we want a ROS to start with, or that they need to accomplish to go up types. In order to move types, they need to demonstrate various tasks that they can do. A lot of people who have experience in health physics or in emergency response probably have historical expertise in this. And so it's not like when you get this position task book, you have to start from scratch. You can go back through your history of what you've done, and we can do historical recognition on a lot of these tasks. So don't be alarmed at the PTD when you look at it. It's not as difficult to accomplish as you might think. But we do that so that it aligns with that national qualification system process. So like I said, we coordinate from the national level. The ROS program is actually an interagency initiative led by FEMA Office of Emerging Threats, but the Department of Homeland Security, New Steel, the DOE, NNSA, FEMA then, and also the Conference of Radiation Control Program Directors all have a seat on the steering committee that kind of drives the actions of the ROS program and what activities occur. And then the FEMA ROS can be, the program itself can be contacted at the email address here on the screen. And so if any of you are interested in more information, you can reach out to me, but you can also reach out to this email address, and we can help fill in any gaps and also provide you with information about upcoming courses, things like that. The courses are offered by CTOS. And so they are, but that doesn't cost to go to the course. If it's offered in your area, you can attend. But if it is offered in Nevada, then they'll pay your travel to get down there. But most of the time they've been going mobile and have been taking it to various state jurisdictions to offer the course. So the ROS is very integrated into CRCPD. We have a lot of volunteers in CRCPD's Homeland Security Emergency Response Section 4 that does a lot of the integration between the ROS and the program itself and the states. And so that's an important caveat of connection to remember. So this would be the process for kind of becoming a ROS. So PER 388 is the CTOS course. That's the initial ROS course. Once someone goes to that course, then they send in their course information and the prerequisites for that course, and then they become a Type 4 ROS if they want to. And they're issued a Type 3 PTB. They work on that to get those sign-offs, whether it's historical recognition or not. And then once they've completed a PTB to all of the tasks being signed off, then we review it. And then the agency having jurisdiction, which is the state where you reside, usually it's the radiation control program person or the emergency response kind of agency person. They would then say, yep, you've completed everything, and type you as a ROS. And then the national system would record that as a type for you. This is what the registration document for CTOS looks like. If you're interested, you can email CTOS at this email address, ask for when the upcoming courses are coming. Off the top of my head, I don't know if they're coming up your area, but there could be. I can't remember where all of the courses are over the next year or so, but they do try to spread them across the country. We had a little hiatus where they weren't being offered very, very much, but there's quite a few here coming up this year and into even later this year, early 2025. So I'm certain one will be coming up your way soon. These are the state ROS coordinators. So you can see we still need one for Washington. So we'll be working with the radiation control program there to get someone designated for that state ROS coordinator role. And so the radiation control program or the emergency response group would be the AHJ or the agency having jurisdiction, and then they would name a state ROS coordinator. So we still need that to happen for Washington, but you can see that Oregon has Hillary Haskins, and you can, kind of look through. So, but in the meantime, if you don't see your state or you want to talk to someone, you can always reach out to me or the FEMA Ross email directly. So this is that email again to the FEMA Ross, and I hope that you guys will consider kind of looking into what this looks like, and trying to figure out how you can plug in to help the state of Washington, state of Oregon, and the nation as a whole. So if we ever do find ourselves in one of these incidents, that we've got a whole cadre of people who know how to plug in and really help us force multiply and make an effective response. So thank you so much for your time today. And again, please reach out if you have any questions, and I'd be happy to take any questions today.
So thank you very much, Angela. Thank you. Good. I think you've answered the question that I was going to ask. So if you guys have a question, please raise your hand or stand up and say who you are, and before the question is asked, and then we can go from there. So any questions?
Okay, I'll stand up. I'm Dan. I'm not sure you even need Ross, but the scariest radiological dispersion events that have contemplated have nothing to do with an explosion. The explosive RDD is a political, well, what do I want to say? It's what politicians can understand. But
Yes.
there's other kinds of dispersion that are more serious. And there was a guy, Peter Zimmerman, who published something in a London newspaper about 20 or 25 years ago called, he didn't have a name for the quantity, but it was a figure of merit for a terrorist who was going to disperse radioactive materials. And the figure of merit was deaths per curie. And look at Guyana. Guyana was pretty low. I think 4 people died acute. And 1,375 curies. You get 0.002 or 3 deaths per curie. But some of these other scenarios are way more serious than that. Is that part of Ross? You didn't mention that kind of thing at all.
Yeah, so what we would typically do in these type of presentations is narrow it down to kind of the, like you said, the 4 kind of big scenarios. But yes, the Ross, we do talk, and we hope that they're proficient in the other types of dispersal, as well as an RED, or a radiological exposure device, where somebody puts it in a movie theater or under a bus seat or something like that, where people don't know that they're being exposed to really significant sources of radiation. So yes, those are definitely of consideration. But most of the national planning guidance that responders receive have to do with the scenarios that we talked about today. So a lot of the translation and the questions and the plans that Ross would intersect with have to do with these topics. But yes, that's again why having someone with a health physics background can really contribute, because we can talk about the activity and the risk from the exposure, and some management of the cleanup and the amount of time we're considering, and all of those things that go into that, because those topics, like the RDD that you described, are the ones that don't have a lot of the guidance that goes with it, because there are so many factors that can go into it. So they're going to need someone quickly available to them to help to put some of that stuff into context and do some rule of thumb calcs real quick, because we don't have a quick template to throw over top like we do for an explosion. So yeah, that's a great point.
Well, Dan Strom again. I got another beef with this whole community. The otherwise brilliant Fred Harper at Sandia did all these explosive experiments. And as I pointed out, even in last summer's health physics meeting, any kind of radioactive source that's big enough to be a really concern in these incidents is not what it was when it was manufactured. So a strontium titanate source. Strontium titanate is a really tough ceramic, melted 2080 degrees Celsius. Fred Harper broke chunks of strontium titanate and got big chunks. Well, there's no strontium 90 source around that's strontium titanate anymore, because strontium turns into yttrium and it turns into zirconium. So you've got essentially what was a solid ceramic, after one half-life is probably powder. And the dispersibility of powder is going to be a whole lot different from explosions using tough ceramics. And when I talked to the lady from ORNL last summer at the health physics meeting, she said, "Oh yeah, that's a good idea. We should look into that." Well, I've been saying this for 20 years. I think you should look into it.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think there's a lot of things that are out there that could really use some, I'm going to say, update or some revisit or some planning. But we try to use what's out there, what gets developed, across, and we know is being dispersed to the populations that are going to be those first responders that are going to be in the middle of it. And so I believe it is important for us to continue to kind of remind people what are the risks that we should be focusing on. So if we think that a certain device, is no longer the same hazard or needs attention, it's hard to get the attention of the people to write those guidance documents. But I do think that is what NCRP is trying to work on to some extent in these documents that they're putting together, is some of the dosimetry and the PPE and some of those recommendations can stand for many different types of incidents. And so if we can take those guidance and we know what the dispersal was, we can quickly say, okay, well, the guidance says this, that doesn't apply here because of this. Then that's where that ROS can really plug in to those situation specific items, even if we can't get someone to give us the bigger planning document that talks about it. So that is hopefully where and that is what a ROS is meant to be, as a state or local asset kind of embedded in their community. We will have FERMAC, we will have all of the federal assets and all of the other resources like YACs and others coming to assist to the states. But in those first hours until they deploy and they're available, this is where the ROS can really be an asset right there locally to help keep the response kind of on track until the bigger resources show up.
So, Todd Davidson, I'm not sure if everyone here knows who I am. So, Todd Davidson, CHP. I would like to state that several CHPs did respond to the cesium release at the Harvard Medical Center. I know I did. I have no idea how many others have, but it is an interesting. It is an interesting incident, mostly because it was unintended, but we learned a lot from it, and we have a lot of data from it that is all available. So if you have any questions about any of that data that you would like to see, I know several of us who can help you get some. So there we are.
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah. And I'm sure that, from that, having you guys have the inner knowledge of that and several of you, the thought behind that, there's the technical aspect of how that dispersed, where it went, all the nooks and crannies, and the amount of contamination that was found in places is really intriguing to kind of understand and help guide how we might better advise responders. From the from the public perception aspect, I find it interesting. That was a very small amount of cesium that actually got dispersed, right? I mean, relatively to what we're talking about. I think when they do these simulations for dispersal, they're using thousands of curies of cesium. So, and thinking about how much and where that all went in just a regular building structure, can you imagine what a cleanup from an RDD would, whether it would be dispersed by, aerosolization over a drone or something, or an explosion, like where would we be finding that, right? Like, it boggles my mind on how we would ever, get cleanup done from that, so.
And Angela, that is a very good point. And it was not an explosion,
Right.
but it was a release that was hoped to be contained, and it absolutely wasn't.
Mhm.
Right. So that is part of the problem. And little things like that go a lot, like especially when it is very dispersive, namely cesium boride.
Yep.
That was released unintentionally, and it is very, very, very dispersive.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So the interesting point on that would be, would we say it was several city blocks that had that happen with, more cesium? Would we actually try to clean it up to the level that was done in Washington, or would we try to get the community convinced to move back to an area because we wouldn't get all the nooks and crannies, right? So that's an interesting question about how eventually do we help guide these communities to figure out what their risk really is, and what's the economic impact of not returning to their city or to their community, versus the radiation risk, and how do we draw that line? I don't know if anybody really knows how we'll draw that line, but I think we'll find ourselves in that role of saying, this is clean enough for the radiation risk, and then it'll be public perception from there, right? So.
Thank you. Well, Andrew, one more comment. Regarding how clean you want to clean something up, I worked in Slavudic in Ukraine, worked at Chernobyl Unit 4 and the New Safe Deployment, as a lot of people from the town did. And it was interesting that after a while, the accident was in '86, I got there in 2011, 25 years later. And local people just absolutely didn't give a hoot about radiation.
Mm-hmm.
They knew that they were eating food that was contaminated with cesium-137. At that point, that's all there was off-site. They didn't care.
Yeah.
The laboratory in the market where you could go monitor your food, they closed it because nobody had used it here.
Yeah.
People just got over that. But I want to go back to something that really caused a lot of panic in Tokyo in 2011. And that was in Japan said that's milk for iodine-131, and they found it was above a limit which had been set for year-long average, and they applied this to an accident scenario. So it was over that limit for one day. People threw away their milk. They went absolutely bananas for essentially an ain't no ramo dose. And that is something you really need to be careful with, I think. And are there Ross program? Are people made aware of the difference between a year-long guideline concentration and what you're going to use in an accident?
Yeah, so we do touch on that. And the Ross course is really meant to be like an introduction to all the different things. And then over the life of a Ross, their experiences, their interactions, their trainings and things as they grow throughout their PTB. So the Ross course, if you take the Ross course, many of you will already know most of it. It's meant to say, here are all the aspects of a response that you do need to know. And then, it's almost like a self-check, like, oh, that's the first time I ever heard of that. Then that's where you need to focus a little bit more effort. And we have all types. So sometimes we have hazmat technicians who are taking the ROS course, and they realize quickly that they need some more education and experience in the health physics side of the fence, where health physicists are pretty strong in that side, but they might need some experience if they've never dealt with FERMAC or NARAC or with DILs or DRLs or something like that. So the course itself is meant to kind of highlight that. But yes, the goal is we have EPA we have EPA cleanup levels, right? Would we use those? Maybe not. And trying to get people to realize that in an emergency, in a widespread incident, there's going to be ways that we're going to have to apply radiation and risk that might not be the way that we typically do it for like a Superfund site or something like that. And so, yes, and we also try to extensively have them understand the NARAC and FERMAC products and understand that you don't brief that product and you don't use it unless you know what all the assumptions are that went into it and you know what it's telling you. Because if it's a plus 12 hours, is it a forward projection? Is it telling you what happened for the last 12 hours? Is it a 1-year exposure? Is it is it assuming 4 days of exposure? And that is driven home routinely. Don't brief a product if you don't know what it's telling you, and don't use a value if that's not what it's meant to be used for. So that's our goal. Not everybody that's making the decisions will always hear that or listen, especially if they're familiar with a number. And I mean more of like the ROS or briefing for decision making, but that is the goal, is to try to circumvent those things if we can.
So thanks again. Yeah. And it is astounding how a differently dispersed material makes a huge difference on what dispersion is. Namely, the bad lesson learned, but it was a lesson learned, but the release of cesium chloride at Harborview, a medical center, and it went far, went dispersive, it was dispersive. That stated no one realized how much, or I'm sorry, how little the protection that was supposed to be there, how little the protective devices was there immediately.
And Todd, let me add, it wasn't cesium chloride. It was cesium chloride, it was barium dichloride, it was barium metal, and cesium God knows what else in there. It wasn't just cesium chloride in there. So, cesium chloride might be installed, you might think you know something about it. But nobody knows what's that I've talked to will tell you, other than, half, if it's 30 years out from the manufacturer, half that cesium is now buried. And that's valent, not monovalent. And so, it's probably not going to be far from powder. So, no wonder it's dispersible.
Right.
And that doesn't apply to cobalt 60, which decays to nickel 60, right? And so that's still a metal. So your cobalt 60 metal pellets don't wind up being dispersible, but cesium or strontium. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Great points.
So again, thank you, Angela.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
You are welcome to stay. We had the room supposedly from 1800 to 2000, but in essence we got it for as long as we want. Okay, and so thank you. I don't know too far or too long, for all of, for everyone here in the room, eat some pizza, discuss. You know, I don't know what else I can